I have never been a sucker for ghost stories. I've never believed in ghosts. And I don't think, honestly, I do hope I'm right that I never will. I also don't believe in demons or angels. It's all just a bit too far out of my imagination for me to think it's all true. Therefore, stories of demonic possessions or seeing some angelic creature, it's all bold to me. However though, I have heard some that were unexplainable. Some stories that might leave you wondering. I know that some of the people that experience these will spend the rest of their lives searching for the answers to their questions. But all the same, they'll never find them. In fact, I'm one of them. Now, let's get one thing straight. I don't think it's a matter of demonic possession. I just can't think of any logical explanation. My brother has always been different. All those years ago when we were young children, and there were quite a few tales to tell. Creepy tales. Tales that would send a chill down your spine. Now, things are a lot quieter. Every now and then, of course, you'll get a call from his wife, saying that he thought he saw a man standing in the front yard with a pitchfork in his hand, staring into the windows, or that he woke up the family in the middle of the night whispering in languages he never even knew. And the most recent was after she had seen something one day. Something really weird. She had gone into the kitchen to wash dishes, but right before she had went through the door, she saw, or she thought that she'd seen, out of the very corner of her eye, two slightly red, dull but sharp bumps in his hair. And then she looked back and there was nothing. Just her husband sitting on the couch, watching the Dodgers game. And nevertheless, these strange occasions were very rare. Sometimes I would go for more than a year without getting a call from them. My relationship with them wasn't so great. I lived in California and he lived in Nebraska, just about as far away as I wanted to be from him. All the calls from my sister-in-law were no more than panicky attempts to find out why these things were happening. All I could do was tell her that he was like this as a child, except it was worse. Then I would sense her feeling of relief and worry at the same time through the miles and miles of telephone wire. We had thought that he was a normal baby, and that nothing was wrong with him. There was only one morning, an average Sunday morning, when we noticed he had a very intent gaze, as if he saw something that we didn't. He would stare at it, full attention and concentration on whatever it was, and then he would come to. And then we were left wondering what was running through his less than a year-old mind. And that was it, until he was 3. One night while we were sleeping, he started screaming and crying, waking us all up instantly. Our mother dashed into the room, followed by our father, flipping on all of the lights. Don was screaming like a maniac, his eyes wide with terror. Our mother picked him up and trying to calm him down, nearly crying herself. A few minutes later, he was starting to settle down, though he was still sobbing uncontrollably. In between wild tears and gasps for breath, he was saying something about claws. We could barely understand it. Though he was very smart for his age, he was only 3 years old and he didn't know much English. He spoke more gibberish than anything, yet we were able to decipher words we didn't think that he'd ever heard before. Half an hour later, he was calm. My mother heated up a bowl of soup and we sat down at the dinner table to ask him again. He was still sniffling, but he could get through what he was trying to say earlier. He had seen claws, dried up, gray and discolored, wrinkly claws snatching at him through the wooden bars of his crib. He said hoarsely that some of them were touching him. Some of the yellow, cracked, inch-long nails were grazing over his skin and pajamas. And worst of all, he couldn't see where they were coming from. And they seemed to be coming from under the bed, but he wasn't sure. His eyes were wide open as he was telling us the story. And my mother ran her fingers through his hair and told him it was just a bad dream. And then he whispered, in a low hushed voice that was barely audible, that it wasn't a dream. This definitely spooked us. We half believed what he had said. We thought this was merely a bad dream, but this was still a serious nightmare, if that's what it was. He couldn't sleep for the next 3 days, and every morning he would tell us that he saw a bump in the rug in our bedroom, as if something small was under it, moving towards the crib like an old Tom and Jerry cartoon. Nothing happened for the next few months, and then one day, he was nowhere to be found. We searched the house until we found him standing in the middle of our room, sleeping. Just standing there. His eyes were shut and he was snoring, which was weird because he didn't snore. Father gently slapped his cheek a few times and he woke up. It took him a minute to realize where he was, but then he was wondering why we took him out of his crib. We looked at each other as if he had just slapped one of his parents. We told him that we didn't take him out of the crib, and he said that he had gone to take a nap in his crib, and he had just woke up right now. Another 3 years passed and everything was the same. And there would be some sort of nightmare every once in a while, or we would catch him doing something unusual. Like the time he asked us why we were carrying flaming pitchforks, or the time he stood during a cartoon and crossed over to the dining table. We sat down and started laughing hysterically. By this time, our mother and father were scared of their own son. There was no reason he should be seeing claws or pitchforks. No reason at all why he should be randomly crying with laughter at the dinner table with nothing funny being said. We couldn't afford to see a doctor and our schedule was too tight to see someone else. We asked other family members, who had no idea what to say. One time we were spending the night at a cousin's house. It was a fun night, nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Until nighttime came and it was late at night when we were asleep. There was only one extra bed, so Don and I had to share it. I was fast asleep, but when I felt something crawling through my hair, I began to stir. I was already waking up, there was no going back to sleep. Whatever was crawling through my hair had done its job. I started to open my eyes, my vision was blurry. So I rubbed them and I looked at the light-up clock on the wall, which read 12 a.m. I felt that crawling thing in my hair again, and I looked up. My brother was on his left elbow, smiling down at me, his right index fingers twisting a few strands of my hair on my head. It was an odd smile, the kind you get when somebody had told you a dirty joke. I was startled and asked what he was doing, and why he was up at this time. He stopped playing with my hair. "Your eyes are glowing red," he whispered, still smiling. I didn't wake up, I didn't fall asleep. I lay awake there all night, waiting for the nightmare to end, but it never did. I tried to close my eyes, but when I did open them back up in disappointment, Don was lying down, eyes shut. I whispered his name 2 times, 3 times, and then I threw one of my cousin's old stuffed animals at him. He was fast asleep. Every morning for the next 4 months, he told us that he had a nightmare the previous night. Each one was the same, and in the nightmare he was crawling on the walls of our bedroom, looking at me, breathing heavily. He said he was perched up in the corner at times, and at others he was crawling around, watching me. Just one more frightening story from him. First there were disembodied claws, and then watching his brother sleep and telling him about the red eyes, and now watching him from the walls. After a week he looked like he hadn't slept at all. He was tired and had no energy. He just moped around the house barely talking, barely noticing anybody's presence. He told us that his nightmares sometimes repeated, or continued from its ending point the previous night. My mother asked him if he had a nightmare last night and he had nodded. He said that he had a dream that he was drowning in a pool. Nobody was helping him. He said that the night before, he had dreamed that he was at a friend's birthday party, and when he wasn't looking, somebody pushed him into the pool, and nobody had noticed. And then, as we were sitting there in horror, he whispered that he had woke up and the Tom and Jerry carpet thingy was back. It would race towards him under the rug and then poke its head out and stare at him, but he couldn't see it because it was too dark. Just a little bump under the rug moving around. He also described a dream in which a dozen or so people were on the front lawn in the dead of night. They were inching their way around in circles, and the same person would slowly start walking towards his window. And this one had happened 3 nights in a row, where he was staring out of his bedroom window the entire time. I decided that I would take a look myself. Enough things had happened that I reconsidered everything that we were experiencing. And that night I stayed awake until I knew everybody else was asleep. I slipped out of bed, grabbed a stick I had sharpened at both ends, and I walked out of the front door and into the driveway. The only light was the dim light from the streetlights. It was, I admit, creepy. I walked around to the front lawn and I saw nothing. I stood there for a moment, trying to picture what it was that Don was imagining. And right before I turned to go back inside, my eyes had caught something, a spot in the grass. I walked up to it, heart beating now, and I realized that it was a footprint in the shape of a boot. And then I saw more, different sizes, different shapes, going in no particular order, as if they were going in circles here and there, everywhere. I glanced up to my bedroom window, and I saw my brother peering out. I dropped my sharpened stick in sudden terror and I took a few steps forward. I walked a few more steps and a few more, until I realized that it wasn't him. I dashed back into the house. A few days later, he was staring again. That unbreakable, unwavering gaze that seemed like it would burn a solid hole through whatever his eyes were set on. I glanced back, looking at the picture frame on the wall. It was a family portrait taken when I was 5 and Don was almost 1. There was nothing unusual about it, but right when I looked back at my brother, who was still staring, I saw something. I looked back at it and it wasn't there. But still, I had saw something there. Something that has stuck with me most vividly all these years, though I only thought that I saw it. Today reminds me of when my sister-in-laws called me from Nebraska, and the stories of what she thought she saw. But this was different. What I saw, or what I thought I saw, was each of our heads in the photo gone. And they simply weren't there. I don't know why. But in the background there's a face, very faint, barely there at all. A smiling face. It almost looked like Don's, but with 2 red stumps poking their dull points out of his messy hair. Light bulbs would explode when Don was angry. Stuffed animals moved when you turned your back. TVs turned on their own accord. Clocks ran backwards. If you glanced out of the bathroom window, you could see that the pool water was thick and red, like blood. And if you glanced back, it was water. Don had dreams that our brains were wasp nests. Don had dreams that our faces were in his windows. Don had dreams that we were dead bodies standing in his closet. When Don had dreams that everybody was nailed to a wooden cross, we took him to see a psychologist. Nowadays, things are quieter. My brother and I haven't seen each other for 20 years. We both have families and we were planning on getting together during the summer to try and start over. Every time I get a call from Nebraska, I get along just fine with Don and his wife and everybody else in his family. I asked Don's wife about him and his behavior. She usually has some sort of story to tell, something small and rather insignificant, like him laughing for no reason. She's a bit jumpy, I guess. And despite the fact that the majority of calls I get from them are just her attempts to seek advice from me, I do my best to hide the fact that I know it. The last one of Don's episodes, as we began to call them when we were in our 20s, before we had separated, was when he was about 14 years old and I was 18. I had invited some of my buddies over to watch the World Series. Soon after they had come and the game began, Don walked out of the hallway into the center of the living room, where he lied down, face down, in front of the entertainment center which the TV sat. Suddenly Don flopped over like a fish out of water, sat upright and yelled a full sentence in complete gibberish. And then he stopped, his eyes widened, and he muttered, "They're coming." He fell right back over, bouncing his head off the ground and making a sick smacking sound that made us cringe, and he went right back to sleep. The 4 of us who had been talking and laughing were now quiet. One of my friends looked at me as if he was scared to death, and the other 2 looked as if I was making silly faces that weren't funny. An earthquake had hit, an 8.9 on the Richter scale, they said many years later. The casualties would have been tremendous, but much of the city's population had changed their schedules for the baseball game, preventing traffic on the highways that collapsed in the quake. We were lucky we hadn't been killed. Pieces of the roof had collapsed all around. Don hadn't even stirred, but nothing touched him. He lay there, still asleep, totally unaware of the earthquake. Huge chunks of thick fallen wood forming a neat circle around him.